Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. It's such an honor to be here. I have been watching for the last couple of years this wonderful symposium online, so now this is my first time being able to be here in person, and it's just a great honor to be able to be here and to present the top research award for this year. The 2023 ISOJ Research Award goes to Dr. Ayleen, Cabas-Mijares, Joy Jenkins, and Laura Nutbar for their paper, News You Can Use, Pragmatic Solidarity as a News Value in Online Community Journalism. So, congratulations. I just want to come on up. I just want to say that the judges were very impressed by the quality and caliber of your research. I want to say everybody should go online and really read this paper. It's making such a huge contribution. So congratulations, Dr. Ayleen Cabas-Mijares. Thank you. Oh, like over here? We'll take a picture together. And now I'd like to invite the other panelists to come on stage here for our research panel. Want to introduce Dr. Subbu Vincent, Director of Journalism and Media Ethics at Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And he is presenting his research, Could Quoting Data Patterns Help in Identifying Journalistic Behavior Online? And then we have, all the way from the Philippines, Raizza Bello, independent journalist and researcher, and Robbin, Dagle, a lecturer in the Department of Communication at Ateneo de Manila University, presenting their research of media shifts and crises, mapping digital journalism and news deserts in the Philippines. We also have Marcus Fang, associate professor of mass communication at Sam Houston State University, and he's presenting his research 5 stars because they tell it like it is, a parasocial examination of mainstream conservative and far-right reviews on Apple Podcasts. And of course, Dr. Ayleen Cabas-Mijares, assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Marquette University, News You Can Use, Pragmatic Solidarity as a News Value in Online Community Journalism. And last but not least, Tracie Powell, founder of the Pivot Fund, presenting research titled Architects of Necessity, Assessing Philanthropic Support for BIPOC News Startups. So let's welcome the panelists. And first we'll have Dr. Vincent come up and present.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to all of you at the ISOJ team for actually having us here. I'm going to quickly say that I am not a PhD, so you can dispense with the doctor for me. I don't mind, but I'm an engineer who wandered off into media by accident. I'm going to talk about, just let me quickly get the slide deck here. Is there a way to get it up? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a problem that has actually bothered me for a while. I was speaking to an unnamed big tech firm, an SVP of engineering at the firm, on when platform news feeds bring up news stories that we all see. It could be Twitter, it could be Google News, it could be Facebook, it could be TikTok. I asked whether they can tell the difference between different types of journalism that are surfacing as news. And the pushback I got was, journalism doesn't have any separable boundaries. It's not a technical thing because it's hard to separate it. We can't actually go upstream of news as content into journalism itself. That's the kind of answer I got. And I was a little bit upset with that because I was like, is this it? Is the big tech companies can say this? This was a few, years ago. So just that made me ask the question, how can we identify journalistic behavior online the way actors are seen online, especially on social media? This doesn't work itself. Can we just keep moving slides? So I'm just quickly going to go. Can we just, move again once more? So one way to look at this idea was to look at just how journalists quote people. Because quoting is a fundamental practice, it's a tradition, a routine, a reflex, if you will, and journalists do this all the time. I thought let's take that attribute itself, that kind of work, and see what kind of data can be built with that as a marker, and then see whether you can build large data sets for news sites around quotes, and then examine what patterns might actually emerge. Can we go to the next one? So this is the thing that you folks all know. Quotes have a whole story behind them. Sometimes one quote that a journalist might have gotten might be like a story in its own right. So, but when you look at quotes as data, you can annotate news articles for these things. You can pull out a quote, you can pull out who spoke the quote, their actual title, organization where they had the title, did the quote even have a title? Because you might have had a quote from a community member. So those are non-titled quotes. So once you build this system using NLP to pull these things out, you have to deal with what is your actual accuracy level. So we have about between 80 to 90% across the actual system we use. Can we go further? Next. Oh, now it's working. Thank you. So it's going backwards, interestingly enough. It's not going forwards. Some reason, my apologies, I don't know. Oh, there it is, sorry, I take that back. All right, so now just imagine you actually have a data set which has a whole bunch of quote data about who's quoting whom, how often they're quoting, are they men, women, across the gender spectrum, also about are they quoted as experts or are they quoted as not? And if you take this kind of data and you also look at the length of the quotes, like how often are these quotes less than 5 words, how often are these quotes more than 5 words? That's an indication of length. And you try to plot this kind of data. One example that you'll get here, just very, this is like an intersection. If you see the bottom, you'll see that it's about the proportion of female quotes on sites. If you see the y-axis, it's the proportion of quotes on a site that are actually shot. And we find interesting boundaries here just looking at how these things actually collide. I'll just, but most importantly, why we put this kind of data together is it has to do with being able to answer, simple questions like this, which you can take at scale from any given site. So how often are men quoted? And so forth, women quoted, and people who actually identify across the trans spectrum, non-binary, and so forth. Now, even if you have the data, what questions do you have? What can you actually ask? You can analyze this for basic source diversity and see whether different types of sites have different types of proportions. Is that even a case? If so, are those proportions meaningful? Are they actually different enough that that would manifest as an actual boundary? Why is that important? Because you always have this question when you talk to social media companies and news aggregator companies about what's called site behavior. They have this, in content moderation, you already have a paradigm called actor behavior where they call actors inauthentic. They can actually take bad actors down. So the disinformation paradigm that intersects with content moderation is more clearly expressed in the form of behavior, account behavior, but journalistic behavior and its authenticity or the lack of it has never really been taken on through the content moderation approach. I've been advocating for a way to look at journalism on its own terms, and that's partly why the intuition comes that if you look at the ethics of the actual reporting work before the news comes out, maybe you'll find interesting things to say. So just quickly, I'm just going to rush through this, but we put together a bunch of data for about 5,000 sites using a bunch of available, corpuses. I've got 2 minutes, I think. And we essentially found that there were actual patterns that existed when you take labeled sites that are already publicly known to be fake news, conspiracy, and so on. When you compare them with high factuality sites, you start seeing that quote proportions actually differ enough that they may constitute what would be a signal that platforms could use. So you could take, for example, hate sites. So you'll find that an interesting aspect of this is the actual proportion of quotes about women are different on hate sites, which is intuitive because a lot of attacks happen there, versus legitimate news sites. So this actually brought the point to us that you can make a bunch of claims if you create custom data sets around journalism ethics. Quotes is one way to look at it. You could look at headlining, you could look at narrative, you could look at a whole bunch of things, but we took only quotes, but you can make these, so we're able to make a few claims in our piece, which is that if the gender proportion is actually, if female quotes are actually very low, that's a particular kind of signal. If it's 20% or less, it usually doesn't mean any of the mainline news sites at all. You can also look at technical sites. So for example, if almost all the quotes are actually people with title, that would usually be a financial site or a regulatory site or a trade site, all specialized kinds of sites. And the most important thing we found was if you're doing a lot of original reporting as opposed to opinion, the proportion of quotes you have that are much longer tend to be over 50%, whereas if you are a purely opinion site, or if you're a hyper-partisan site, or you're a disinformation site, usually because you're lifting quotes or you're quoting people in short, and you're not investing time and boots on the groundwork, there's a tendency, you'll actually have much lower proportion of long quotes. So there was a signal of what you would call original work in this approach. And so our overall conclusion was that you could start with quoting ethics as a way to identify different types of actors, and maybe those companies that are aggregating lots of news can go upstream of news as a piece of content into the journalistic provenance of the work and improve their actual signal paradigms with that work. That's the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will have Raizza, Bello, and Robbin Dagle.
Could we have the slide, please? It's not moving. Okay, sorry. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're glad to be here to presenting to you our baseline study on news sites and all over the Philippines. And we're gonna also present to you how this offers an introductory or an exploration into news deserts in our country. So just to give a background on this research project, of course, in the Philippines, as you may all well know, we're perennially attacked by our government for critical reporting, and we always face online harassment for critical reporting, especially in digital platforms. One specific or critical example of this is broadcasting giant ABS-CBN's franchise non-renewal in May 2020. So what is the impact of that? They were forced to cease operations all over the Philippines because they had the largest reach in terms of news and information for local communities nationwide. Apart from that, a lot of local newspapers and community newspapers were also forced to either close their operations or either to move online as news audiences shifted to online. So what the Asian Center for Journalism at Ateneo de Manila University and the media organization Internews did was to collaborate on a project. It's called the Ads for News Project. So basically, it endeavors to create a nationwide index of news sites all over the country, and we want it to be credible and trustworthy enough for the advertisers to actually potentially fund these news websites for operations. So this is the initial mapping that we have. So that's a vetted news site mapping of over 100 websites in the Philippines. A little caveat about this mapping, not all websites or legitimate websites in the country might have been listed because we have limited manpower going through the operations during the research project. But just as a context to the findings which Robbin will share in a bit, We have 3 main island groups in the Philippines. So the northern part is Luzon, the central part is Visayas, and the southern part is Mindanao. The colors on the map is yellow is for the local media, red is for the regional news sites, and green is for the national news sites. So we'll be sharing 3 important findings as per our research project.
All right, thank you so much, Raizza. So I'll briefly go over the 3 main findings that we uncovered for this paper. So the first research question, we take a look at the slides, please. So our first research question, essentially, what is the regional distribution of news sites in the Philippines? 62 news sites were based in the administrative regions in Luzon, the biggest island group north of the country. Of this, 34 came from the capital region, which is Metro Manila, where national media outlets have more resources and the widest reach. So regions of Visayas have 24, while 17 were in the southernmost region of Mindanao. And we found that there was no single news website, vetted news website, based in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Our second question is, what are the common issues and characteristics of these vetted news sites? So across all sites, 3 main issues were observed. First is the lack of transparency on media ownership. Second is the absence of or inadequacy of code of ethics and privacy policies. And third is a difficulty in the identification of advertising and sponsorship content. We found also that local and regional news sites have tended to generally publish more lifestyle content, press releases, and political propaganda than so-called hard news. And one key observation we found is that local and community media are using Facebook as a news platform even without the use of a standalone news site. So we're finding that instead of building an online news site as is pretty standard here, we automatically go to social media. And lastly, which regions may be considered as online news deserts? So as mentioned a while ago, the Bangsamoro region had no news site in the final database. Just a little context about the Bangsamoro region. It was officially established in 2019 following nearly 2 decades of peace talks between the Philippine government and the secessionist More Islamic Liberation Front. And this context hews closely to previous studies linking the presence of news deserts in poorer, more rural areas away from the nation's political and economic centers. So the region's lack of visibility and representation in the online news space underscores this marginalization in the national news. So to sum it all up, let me bring the mic back to Raizza.
So what is the importance of this news project? In the Philippines, we don't have really a mapping of the different media platforms, whether it's on TV, online, or print news. So we actually want to present a baseline or an initial mapping that could help us start categorizing or understanding what are the gaps in terms of online journalism in the Philippines. And from those gaps, how do we enter into different research studies that could help us better understand how to operate as media organizations and journalists. And one thing that we're looking at, as we said a while ago, is to focus from shifting from the media perspective, which this research is initially presenting right now, to the community perspective. Trying to start to understand what is news for the public or the local communities, how do they actually use news for their daily lives, and actually to question from a global south perspective, do we really have news deserts in our country, or do we have specific or unique news media and information ecosystems wherein these local communities operate, especially given the context in our country that we have so much distrust in the media and we have so much disinformation, especially in online platforms or the social media. So just to end, just to close this presentation, we hope that this research could actually help understand or give more representation on how global South nations operate in terms of the online spaces, and how we could actually learn from the communities or the people on how we can change our models or our practices in newsrooms or even our independent journalism spaces, especially to relate in terms of how do they understand the stories that we produce, and how do we actually intend to serve the public by sharing or actually reporting different issues in our sectors. Thank you so much, and we hope to have a nice conversation later.
Next to Marcus Funk.
Here I am asking how it works, and there's a big green button on there right in front of me. So I'm Dr. Marcus Funk. I'm an associate professor of mass communication at Sam Houston State University, and I'm a proud Longhorn graduate. It's always nice to be back here on campus. So let's talk about podcasting. Who wants to talk about podcasting? Can we pull up the slides? Yeah. Slides? Thank you. So my co-authors and I wanted to consider podcasting, and we wanted to talk about some of the eccentricities and some of the more specific emotional parts of the medium, because podcasting really complicates conventional notions of journalism, because it's difficult to be just the facts man in a medium that is so personality driven. Right now, I'm communicating much more about myself as a person over, vocals, verbally, than I would be doing typing out. It's a little easier to be more rigid and objective in print, in text, than it is in audio. And two, podcasting is also really, really famous for facilitating and building personal, emotional communities, personal and emotional bonds. And the most successful podcasters out there are the ones that feel the most human, right? The ones that have the most personality to share. This touches on decades of scholarship on what academics call parasocial phenomenon. And the best example of this is Uncle Steve. This was something that a student of mine came up with a few years ago. Anybody want to take a guess who Uncle Steve is? Steve Harvey, right? This was someone who spent every day watching Steve Harvey in her home, because all of his shows would always be on, her mother would always be watching them, and she got to the point where she felt like she knew Steve Harvey as a person. Never met him before. Felt like he was a personal part of her life. And we see that across media platforms. These are parasocial relationships. Our brains aren't always great at distinguishing between real, actual relationships with people we know versus mediated relationships that are synthetic. And that happens in the moment, in direct interaction. That happens in prolonged time when you see Uncle Steve over and over and over and over again, week in, week out. And that happens when those bonds break, when you cancel a show or you walk away from somebody. This is old news for a lot of journalists. TV broadcasters, local TV journalists have been working in this realm for decades. They know that those bonds they facilitate with audiences are often personal. I grew up watching KHOU. I felt like I knew Neil Frank and Giff Nielsen as people because I saw them every day. And that's typical, that's normal, that's parasocial. And so my co-authors and I thought, well, what does that look like in podcasts? So we looked at Apple Podcast reviews, where we thought these are most likely to manifest. And first part of this was to see, are these reviews focused on journalism, the content, the news, the things we spend so much time and energy talking about, or are they focused on personality, those parasocial interactions, those parasocial feelings that should, in theory, be ancillary to the actual journalism, but in reality and practice wind up driving a lot of our audiences. Phase one was to look at some daily news podcasts. We started with Up First and Axios Today. These are very short, 10 to 15-minute podcasts that drop every weekday morning. And there's not a lot of time or room for personal disclosures or personality because they're trying to blitz through big, important news events. And what we found qualitatively when we studied these is, we saw a lot of personal familiarity, a lot of emotions in these reviews. People grounded their responses, their feelings toward these podcasts, not on their news content for the most part, but on how they built it into their routines and how they personally responded to those hosts. This was almost every review. Often it was very explicit. How can you love someone you've never seen, right? But they said that, they wrote that. So then we thought, all right, we see that in these mainstream ones. What about some center-right news podcasts? Same thing, similar findings. Maybe a little bit less personal praise, but it was all still there. And we thought, all right, let's stretch it even further. What about the far right? What about some really genuinely fringy podcasts? And again, yeah, not only did we see it, but it was much more intense. There was a great deal more, both in terms of frequency and in terms of intensity. The ones on the far, far right were reviewed in much more personal terms, even though personal terms were consistent for all of the reviews. So this qualitative phase one, this is what we found. Personal terms, personal terms, personal terms with gusto, right? Limited focus on news and news coverage. All the things we spent all this time thinking about didn't show up so much in the Apple Podcast reviews. So then we thought, let's look at this quantitatively. We used a computerized content analysis software called Diction to consider just a bunch of Apple Podcast reviews. 48 podcasts, around 21,000 reviews. So we said, let's look at reviews of mainstream news podcasts. Let's look at the center right. Let's look at the far right, which, just to be clear, are two different things. But let's also consider true crime, sports, and business podcasts. Journalism podcasts that are operating in a slightly different realm. We looked at word dictionaries. These are basically word counters, word tabulators that count the frequency of terms associated with parasocial feelings in different ways. What we found was that across the board, those mainstream news podcasts included significantly fewer parasocial terms, much less parasocial language than right, center right, or far right reviews for all those dictionaries. But we found the same thing was true comparing the mainstream news for true crime, sports, and business for most of those dictionaries. Takeaways here, podcast reviews are based largely on personality. Personal language is significantly less common in reviews for mainstream news podcasts, basically everyone in this room, compared to conservative and far-right podcasts and compared to other mainstream formats. There are really two ways of looking at this. One is to say it's an apples and oranges comparison. Obviously, daily news podcasts, weekly news podcasts are not the same as those others. That's one way of looking at it. It's not one I would recommend. What I would say is consider it like this. Podcast reviewers judge based on personality more than anything else. That's especially important, so show some personality. Second, keep in mind that in Apple Podcasts and Spotify, the categories aren't real rigorously defined. You could have a catch-all news podcast category that has mainstream, right, and far-right podcasts right next to each other. And if those reviews are based on personality, then we put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage compared to conspiracy theory podcasts and just the spectrum of ideology if we don't emphasize this more and more routinely. And I think this also informs broader and deeper conversations about what transparency and credibility in news looks like, both in podcasting and in 2023. Thanks.
Next, we have Ayleen Cabas-Mijares.
All right, hello, good afternoon. Thank you for being here, and thank you also, ISOJ, for this recognition. It's very special. I also want to thank my wonderful co-author, Dr. Joy Jenkins, and also Laura Notbart, who is not here, but she's a master's student, she graduated at Markkula University and provided great insight and growth to our study. And finally, I also want to thank our partners in this research, the Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, because without their work, we wouldn't basically have this basis to understand how journalism can be rethought and reshaped into a much more positive and transformative institution. So news, you can use pragmatic solidarity as a news value in online community journalism is grounded on this concept of solidarity, and specifically of solidarity as a news value. The point of solidarity, and here at UT Austin, you might be very familiar with it because it is at the core of another excellent scholar's work, Anita Varma, is all about considering a commitment to social justice as that commitment to every single person's dignity and our obligation as human beings and journalists to uphold every single person's right to live with dignity. So when we consider solidarity as a news value, we adopt it as a principle that guides our news making. And when we think of solidarity at the forefront of news making, we start understanding marginalized communities differently. We start understanding elites differently, and the purpose of our work in a different lens. All of it gears towards achieving social justice and that life with dignity for every single member of the public. So pragmatic solidarity in a specific is much more action-oriented. It focuses on the service aspects of journalism that allow us to understand solidarity not just as, oh, yes, it would be cool that we all have the ability to live with dignity, but that we have an obligation with our peers to help each other live with dignity. So it is action-oriented. And it is pragmatic because it goes into those specific practices and actions that can help us in the short term. So in our study, we basically asked how pragmatic solidarity manifests in hyperlocal online news coverage, and how those pragmatic solidarity basically help journalism focus on action. It is important to do it in the hyperlocal level and also in a newsroom like NNS, the Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, because a lot of work in solidarity has been done about like big mainstream newsrooms talking about marginalized communities, but what our work brings to the table is that it talks about newsrooms that are mostly composed by marginalized communities, talking to marginalized communities. And this is where the pragmatic aspect comes to the light much more strongly. So to give you a very brief, to situate you in NNS work, this is a hyperlocal online news service that it specifically targets 18 Latinx and Black neighborhoods in Milwaukee. So it operates in the urban level, and it is one of the most, if not the most, diverse newsroom in Milwaukee. And many of these journalists grew up in the neighborhoods that they are covering, so they are deeply connected with, and they have personal investments in the betterment and well-being of these communities. So, to go straight to our findings, after interviewing NNS reporters and editors, and also looking at their coverage throughout a couple of years, we saw that in their pragmatic solidarity informed reporting, 3 themes were very salient. First, context matters. NNS, even though they were focused on action and solutions, they were still situating the struggles of these communities in larger systemic issues. They were very adamant in demonstrating and showing that the issues that these communities go through are not the result of them being deviant or incompetent. It was part of a larger structural issue. Then, as they were doing that, they were centering the voices of the community. The vast majority of the sources that informed the reporting of NNS were members of the community. They were treated as authorities in explaining the realities and also in explaining how to get out of their own problems. Which takes us to the third one, which is showing the community in action. A lot of mainstream reporting usually focuses on the doom and gloom type of stories of these communities. Instead, NNS flipped that on its head by showing the efforts of the community and the initiatives that came from the community to change their own circumstances. So the big takeaways of this work and of understanding and seeing journalism that is by the community and for the minoritized community is that the voices of the people who are at the receiving end of oppression matter. It is treating those people and their perspectives, not just their sub-stories, but their perspective as the grounding of all our reporting and the grounding about their issues and about the solutions that will be effective in these communities. So it is, Pragmatic Solidarity invites us to do this kind of like paradigmatic shift where we start seeing minoritized communities as resources, as agents of the solutions that we largely need in society instead of just victims of some unnamed circumstances. So thank you. I look forward to keep talking about this.
And finally, we have Tracie Powell.
It works, so don't worry. Okay.
Am I pointed in the right direction? Oh. Is it the top one or the bottom? The green one on the top. Okay, here we go. Okay, so thank you. This research took about 18 months. It all started at Harvard's Shorenstein Center, where I had access to so many great and inspirational people, including Thomas Patterson, who helped me design the survey that we used to, we wanted to talk with publishers and founders who had just started receiving funding through the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. We wanted to learn what was working and what we could do differently. And some of these founders included folks that we now celebrate: MLK 50, Sahan Journal, Documented, the Milwaukee News Service. And so they're just starting to get their dollars. They had just gotten their dollars, and we wanted to understand the impact. So we interviewed, as it says, over 100 people. We sent out 500 surveys. They tell me that's pretty good return. We also did a focus group to have a better understanding. And we used critical race theory to assess our findings. For non-academics, critical race theory is an academic and legal framework that denotes that systematic racism is part of American society, from education and housing to employment and healthcare. Critical race theory recognizes that racism is more than just the result of individual bias and prejudice. It is embedded in laws, policies, and institutions that uphold and reproduce racial inequalities. In this context, we use CRT to, one, identify the intersection of racism and other forms of subordination. Our primary research question asked, how does the intervention of philanthropic funding impact the health and sustainability of BIPOC news organizations? And two, to challenge dominant ideology and its assumptions. In our research, we found that philanthropic interventions often require a form of means testing and qualification, which fails to recognize the needs and desires of independent news outlets and the communities they serve. The research indicates a perhaps fundamental misunderstanding and mischaracterization of the landscape of local news. Finally, while it's a good thing that more money was flowing into journalism, we did find that philanthropy is in large part replicating a system that we already have, one that is failing us and leaves behind marginalized communities. Some of philanthropy's policies and practices perpetuate an uneven playing field. So even when BIPOC-led newsrooms receive foundation funding, it comes with conditions. Founders are required to participate in training or accelerator-type programs that often don't benefit the newsroom or its community. We found that BIPOC founders are often required to either participate in these accelerators in exchange for funding or purchase memberships in white-led associations that negatively impact them experientially. Many funders who say they only want to support nonprofit newsrooms as a shorthand to ensure dollars are being used for public good leave out the vast majority of BIPOC-led and serving outlets because these outlets are often for-profit. Funders don't know, again, who they should be investing in or where these organizations are located because many BIPOC-led and serving community news outlets aren't on anybody's radar. As one of my colleagues mentioned earlier, most of them are on Facebook. That's where they got their start. And it's because they can use that platform for free and their community members can also. Even when funders give money to support BIPOC newsrooms, specifically those dollars often go to white-led organizations to filter or trickle down to BIPOC newsrooms. Just as trickle-down economics do not work, neither does trickle-down funding. These dollars actually build business models for the white-led associations at the expense or on the backs of publishers and founders of color. We found that the newsrooms aren't able to add to their capacity or create sustainability, but the associations do. The patterns we identified in the research contribute to increasing financial hardships on newsrooms led by and serving people of color, which is the opposite of what funders say they intend. So we came up with a set of recommendations. One of the main recommendations is yes, dollars can support storytelling and reporting on particular issues, as well as encourage collaboration between traditional news organizations and news outlets led by and for people of color, and among news outlets led by people of color themselves. But more important, grants can provide support for developing infrastructure to identify new and sustainable revenue sources. They need general operating support. Journalism training and technology support to assist in digital transitions is good too, but only if it is accompanied by the change-making dollars to execute on these opportunities. Media outlets led by and for people of color need a space to share ideas, learn from each other, and to collaborate. These learning spaces in the form of workshops, retreats, immersion and exchange experiences could serve as a resource for new outlets and as for a networking opportunity between funders, traditional corporate media, advertisers, and news outlets led by people of color. You can also support those who give directly to these organizations and know where they are. You can support the Pivot Fund, and there are a couple of other organizations that do this work as well. The Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, one, and also the Listing Post Collective. It's important to support these organizations financially, which is what they ask for, which helps us to identify people who are culturally competent at capacity building and sustainability, providing resources to these organizations so that they can provide more trusted, credible, relevant news and information to the communities long overlooked and underserved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracie. I just want to commend all of the authors for these amazing pieces of scholarship. They're making such important contributions in so many different ways. And I know we have a few minutes for some questions. We have a mixed audience out here in terms of journalists, practitioners, faculty, scholars, and people who are doing research. So I wonder if you could take just a minute to say, what do you hope will be the impact, or what is some of the potential impacts of your research, and how do you see it influencing in a positive way the journalism practice and journalism field? maybe we can start with Tracie.
My hope is that this research is used to help funders better understand the landscape and direct sources to communities, by the way, who are a rising majority in this country, that provide credible, fact-based information to communities where they are. We've recently started a new survey directed at funders, and there is a tremendous disconnect between the founders and their communities and the funders who want to support these communities. And so a lot of dollars are flowing to print and online journalism, and as you've heard on this, as part of this panel, communities are elsewhere. They're podcasts, they're on social media, and so if you really want to reach and impact people in this country, communities in this country, then that's where the funding needs to be directed. And so I hope this research informs us better on how to do that.
Thank you. Maybe we just work our way this way.
Yeah, this works. So one of the big takeaways I feel from this research around solidarity and pragmatic solidarity specifically is that I hope it helps journalists understand and give due respect and authority to the voices of minoritized people or marginalized people. There is a measurable bias toward elites, toward academics, toward government officials in our sourcing schemes. And I know that, like, I'm a journalist, I know there's a reason for that, but that also means that we have a big blind spot in the way we cover especially social inequities and how we represent the people who are experiencing social inequities. I feel the work of NNS recognizes that there is expertise in communities, and it is an expertise about their own circumstances, them understanding deeply and in very nuanced ways how systemic oppression and discrimination works, and them acting on it in a generative, proactive way. So these are not just communities in trouble or troubled communities. There's real expertise that we as journalists with our elite bias are not recognizing and not giving the appropriate space to. Like, as I've told my students in my classes, if you want to understand issues like food insecurity, for example, it is not going to be the government official who's going to tell you exactly how it works and what initiatives work or not. It's going to be food insecure people. If you do not talk to food insecure people, you will not have a nuanced understanding of how it works on a daily basis. So work in solidarity and work in pragmatic solidarity, I hope, will help us change our focus and recognize expertise where it really is.
I think really the unifying theme throughout these presentations is authenticity in media. And much of that speaks to marginalized or isolated communities, and much of that speaks to our ability as journalists to be authentic, to be humans. You know, that panel on AI and generative AI this morning made me think, okay, how can we be less robotic? How can we be less AI-y? And how can we speak to our audiences and our listeners and our communities in more realistic and more authentic ways? And I think that's the challenge for everyone in this room, not just, you know, the practitioners, not just the academics, but it's how do we conceptualize, you know, emotional and human journalism in a way that we didn't used to. Because it used to be just the facts, that's it, let everybody just make up their own minds. And that's what a lot of people in this country still say they want from the news media. And then they make editorial choices or they watch or listen to media that don't follow those same rules. And so there's a challenge there. How do we communicate authentically to and with and for a network, a diversity of communities, while also revealing enough of ourselves to be human and relatable, but not so much that we bias or taint our journalism? And that's really tricky to do, and I think it's even trickier to teach in a lot of ways.
For our context, I think this is the research is just a baseline study on how to better understand our audiences in the Philippines. But the deeper question that we would like to ask is, what is the disconnect between journalists, and our publics and our audiences. That has been a running theme, a running question, a running debate in our country ever since 2016 when President Duterte won, and now President Marcos Jr. Won after a huge deluge of disinformation. The Philippines is patient zero, as they call it, of disinformation. And I think we want to go to the grassroots. We want to understand what the disconnect is. And I think that's hopefully where our research would lead us in the academe and journalists to better understand what's going on with our people. Maybe Raizza has something to add to that.
Well, just quickly also, I think one important impact that this research could make is to actually create accountability mechanisms in our country, because we don't have organizations for online news sites. We don't have information on who's actually a credible media organization, especially in the digital sphere. So I think it's a starting point for us to understand, especially with the qualitative findings about the news sites, on what is the possible standards to establish in terms of actually having an ethical practice or a quality practice for online journalism in the country. And as Robbin said, we'd like to always connect it to the grassroots and go back to the community. And that's what the News Desert Insight is trying to offer. What are the gaps of our practice in terms of our connection to the local communities nationwide? We don't know that yet. That's why we're having so much trouble with disinformation, and we're experiencing so much distrust from the public. So we really hope that this research could be a starting point to bridge both the media sector, the media practitioners in our country, or maybe beyond our country, and actually to bridge them to the communities which really intend to serve and work with, so that they understand what is journalism for and what journalism could be in the future.
So it's a really great question to ask about where we think the impact of our work needs to go. And I feel like it's easier to point out to Ayleen here, because her paper on Pragmatic, just solidarity, links to Anita's work, Anita Verma's work, whom I know quite well. I'm sorry that Anita's not here today. My work actually links to that in a strange way. Today, platform companies cannot tell if pragmatic solidarity is a news value in the story they're actually surfacing. Their algorithms cannot tell the difference between, was the food insecure person even quoted, or was the official with the food security program in my country actually quoted? So just building a journalistic language model like JLM, I'm less interested in LLMs. But I am interested in using that kind of technology to diagnose text and quoting and see what kind of news values are even there. So I feel there's more work one can do just linking up.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all of the authors for your work once again, and I want to invite everybody to go to online and take a look at their work, and it's also going to be published in print. And so let's give our panelists another round of applause, and thank you to the audience as well.